All right, we welcome you to week 8 of our study on the book of Job. We're ready for chapters 29, 30, and 31 this evening. James is sick this evening. He's nauseous and has something going on in his stomach, so he's decided to stay home rather than pass out while he speaks tonight. So that's going to offer up a few extra minutes to do something we haven't had a chance to do on any of our other nights, so I look forward to that. Let's just jump into the study, and I'll make the review part of what I do as we move through this evening. The Lord be with you. With you. Let us pray. God, from almost the first day that we ever enter a church or read your word, we're told that if we'll come to you when we're weary or heavy burdened, you will respond to us and give us rest. But honestly, sometimes we call on you, but we hear nothing and see nothing. It feels like you're ignoring us, and we wonder if we've done something to perturb you. We know we could use more patience, but it would save us a lot of fretting if we didn't feel so completely cut off from you. Just letting you know, for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, all right, Job 29. We're going to be kind of working back through something that we did way back in week 1, and here's why. In chapters 1 through 3, Job was introduced to us. Now, he was introduced to us from sort of a divine perspective. The narrator talked to us about Job, and then God talked about Job, and Satan talked about Job. He didn't really talk about himself too much, but it was all these others talking about him. And then, and we were told at that point that this is a really, really good man. He's pious, he's innocent, he's blameless, he does the right things. This is a man who truly can be said to be a friend of God. And then chapters 4 through 27 really were an in-depth look at all of the suffering that he began having to deal with, and he didn't deal with it very well. He's still not dealing with it very well, but we looked at his suffering in light of divine retributive justice. And certainly by the time we got to chapter 27, if not long before that point, we probably began deciding, this is kind of a dead end. This isn't going to work. It's not going to get us to where we think we want to go. Retributive justice doesn't seem to be the answer for suffering in any way, shape, or form. So last week when we came together in chapter 28, we sort of put a halt to where we were at and said we need to start over. And so chapter 28 was a look not at retributive justice anymore, but we did a huge switch because this is one of the books in the wisdom literature portion of the Hebrew canon. We began looking at wisdom from a Hebrew perspective. And that laid a foundation to ask the question, might wisdom be a way to understand what is going on in suffering, why we suffer, and how we can deal and address our suffering? Beginning tonight in chapter 29, and certainly for the next 2 chapters, we're going to look at Job, I'm going to say from below. Job is going to talk about himself. We're going to readdress the same things we did back in chapters 1 and 2, but rather than from above, from heaven down, we're going to do it from below, from earth up. So it ought to give us a little bit different perspective on Job, and hopefully by the time we finish this evening, you'll have a much better understanding of who Job was and why he is so distraught, why he is lamenting so greatly through these chapters. Now, the very last thing that he said back in chapter 27, he had declared a couple of things, and he now wants to begin making good on those, and he will this evening in what he says. The first one is he continues to declare that he is innocent, that he should not be suffering based on the way people understand that suffering is some kind of punishment for having done something wrong. He didn't do anything wrong, so therefore he ought not to be suffering the way he is. But unless suffering has something else going on, he's innocent, however, of any kind of wrong. And then secondly, he has declared over and over again, but now he's going to make a switch, and by the time we finish tonight, he's going to take an oath in which he declares why he can be so certain about this. He's going to say that God isn't listening to him. God just seems to have closed his ears to his friend, Job. So he wants to take his case directly to God. It hasn't gotten him anywhere talking to his friends. So he wants now to redouble his efforts to actually have an audience with God himself. So he's going to take his case directly to God. So tonight we're going to do three things. In chapter 29, Job is going to look at his past life. What was life like BS, before suffering? And then in chapter 30, he's going to address his present situation, what life is like for him now. And then in chapter 31, he's going to, by the time we get to the end of the chapter, he's going to take an oath. He's essentially going to go on record declaring to God, you need to answer me, and here's why you need to answer me. And he's going to give 14 reasons as to why God needs to answer him. So, I mean, it's out there wide open by the time we get to the end of chapter 31 tonight. So, with that, let's just jump into 29 and begin taking this new, deeper look at Job from sort of the ground up, from earth to heaven look. And we're going to start, though, even though we want to talk about Job, Job starts off by talking about God and the way that God has blessed him in the past. In the past, God offered to Job all kinds of protection. Now, once he began suffering, he's beginning to think that God is sort of hedging him in, fencing him in, and not letting him do anything. But in the past, he saw that as a wonderful form of protection that he had received from God, and he appreciated that. He appreciated that protection. He received from God all kinds of direction as well, and he took it. When God spoke to him, he listened and took it as good advice. And he received from God blessing, for which he was grateful. He received that blessing with much joy. And I think we would say we probably do the same thing. It is interesting to me. I don't know if this has been your experience or not, but when I would spend time with folks in the hospitals, everybody wanted prayer before they went into surgery. But afterwards, nobody wanted to offer prayers of thanksgiving. They forgot about that. Now they were good, they were ready to go, and God sort of left God out at that point. But Job didn't. Job was always grateful for everything that he received from God. So, bottom line, his life was filled with all kinds of abundance, goodness. Life could not have been better. And we can probably, not that we would want to claim that we are innocent or blameless like Job, but we can probably remember back to the prime of our own life when our bodies worked well and everything was great and life was just wonderful. And we had blessings around every single corner, and jobs were moving well, and the families were growing, etc., and life was good. Well, that's what Job is talking about here in these first 6 verses or so. Then beginning in verse 7, he shifts now to him, and as a result of the way God had blessed him, he begins talking about the respect that people paid to him, to Job. When Job spoke, everyone listened, is essentially the line that we come across in these verses. If you remember the old ad about E.F. Hutton, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everyone listens. Well, that's the way Job was. And the respect that he received from persons was absolutely complete. It was unchallenged. People loved for Job to come around and to open his mouth and speak. Sometimes people appreciate us being around, but they're not so interested in what we might say. They were very interested in what Job would say. And he talks specifically in these verses about going to the city gate. The city gate had a function much more so than just letting people into and out of a walled city, regardless of when Job actually lived. For a good 1,500, 2,000 years, city gates functioned in this particular capacity. It was the place where you would have court trials. Marketplaces were set up in the vicinity of the city gate. It was where the town hall was, where you would have forums and committee meetings and council meetings of various stripes. as well as just the general sort of place that if we think in terms of our own American past, this would be the front portion of the store or the front stoop of the store where there would always be a barrel with a checkerboard on top where the guys could sit and play checkers, or there would be a thing of cheese where they could get some cheese, or if nothing else, just sit there and whittle. All of that would be taking place at the city gate. So when Job would go to the city gate, he says that all of the commotion that there would be going on in that place would come to a stop when he showed up. It would be total respect for him. Same sort of way that, when a judge enters a courtroom, everybody stops talking, or when the priest enters the nave, or when the president enters a congressional chamber, at least in former days. It's quiet. People are ready to listen, and they offer respect to the person who has just entered. And Job says that was certainly his experience as well. Beginning in verse 11, Job now talks about the way he himself personally lived, not just showing up and seeing how others treated him, but what did Job himself do? Well, because Job was a righteous individual, truly a righteous individual, not one who just talked about being righteous, he truly did defend the poor and the homeless and the orphans and all of those kinds of persons that Scripture says to care for, because God has put them in our hands to care for them. And the response that he would receive from them was regularly, typically but regularly, commendation. They were grateful for those things that he would do on their behalf. When he responded to the hopeless, the widows, and the others that just didn't have anything at all, their response to him was that they would bless him. They were filled with joy because of the good things that they received. In the same way that family to family, or some of the other things that are done here, people are just so grateful. They express that gratitude to you when you work with them. Well, Job says that's what people did for me as well. And he didn't just talk about being righteous or just. He actually did those things on a regular basis. It wasn't in front of the cameras. He did it all the time, whether anybody saw it or not. And he didn't just practice mercy, where he would put a Band-Aid on somebody who was hurting. He would also work behind the scenes to try to work justice on their behalf. So, for instance, in other words, he didn't just do family to family and provide bags of groceries to somebody who was hungry. He also worked to try to create better, just laws so that food would be distributed, so you didn't have hunger even to start with. That's the difference between mercy and justice. So he did both of those in his life. And when he acted as a judge, when he would there at the city gate function as a judge to arbitrate between different persons, even though so many judges and lawyers really do nothing more than just enforce the status quo, Job says that he didn't do that. He didn't take advantage of the position to just reinforce the way things are. What he would do is he would investigate and see what was not so much legal, but what was in fact moral. What was the right thing to do, not the legal thing to do. Well, good luck if you're hoping to have something moral take place in the court systems today. It's legal. It's the backing up of the status quo so often that occurs there. But Job says that's not the way he worked at it. Because of the way he lived, beginning in verse 18, in just a short section, he says, I had every right to expect God to therefore take care of me. God says in Scripture that God will in fact do that. If you do X, Y, and Z, God will respond in these particular ways. Job did it. He expects God to follow through on his behalf. He had achieved for himself, he thought, a long life. It's not that he thought he was going to be immortal and live forever. He knew that one day he would in fact get sick and ill and die, but he expected, because of the way he lived, to be able to just live out his full number of days and then effectively lay down and die. And it would not be a life filled with pain and hurt and anguish, but it would be really a life of blessing where you've lived a wonderfully full life. And now you know it's time to move on. His judgments were well, enough for that. The very last particular section, he describes the way that in just one more way, the way that people respected him when he would show up in their midst. You know, so many times authority figures, their words are resented, but his were not. They were accepted fully by the persons to whom he would speak. The same way that they received every single one of the things that he did on their behalf. And, you know, that was certainly in part because his judgments were not just wise, they were grounded in his own personal goodness. He lived the things he talked about. And so it just flowed out of him very naturally. And, you know, you can see that in certain people. Those are the pastoral figures in almost any church, the persons to whom people gravitate when they're having a tough time. Because these are the persons that always have a good word to speak to you. They have comfort to be able to offer. They have wisdom to share. People know who those are, even though you might not be able to name them off the top of your head. If you sit down and think about it, you can almost always recall who it is that is like that in the church. So the conclusion to chapter 29 is that Job really was a good man, just like we learned way back in chapters 1 and 2. But now we've heard it from Job's mouth. These are the things I did. These are the way people responded to me, and we discovered that it's exactly like what we would have expected to have been the case based on chapters 1 and 2. He really was a difference maker. And I think that's kind of the bottom line for Job. So, having said that, and since James is not with us tonight, have any of you messed around with these questions that are at the end of any of the chapters? If you have not, you get to do that this evening. On page 42, I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to think about this. Well, no, it's not 42, it's 48. Yeah, 48. First question on page 48 is really in response to chapter 29. What are some righteous acts in my own past that honored God, regarding which I can be justly proud? You know, it's not bragging if you're reflecting on the way you've lived, and it's just being honest. There's no reason to engage in false modesty, but what are the good things that you have done in your life? Take a couple minutes and reflect on it. No, I'm not going to ask you to share them unless you just really wanted to. This is for your own personal edification. wonderful thing about answering a question like that is that your answers will not be like anybody else's, at least not in details. And to go a step further with that, Paul, of course, talked about it's ridiculous in the Christian faith to think that everybody's going to become exactly alike. That's not what we're after. Not everybody's going to be an eyeball or an ear or a foot. If everybody were one of those, we wouldn't have much of a body. We would just be a part. But together, the melding of all of our individual answers begins to make a whole that is much more than even just the sum of its parts. It really does enable us to do wonderful things on behalf of God. So it's a good thing, at least once in a while, to reflect upon the blessings we've received, and that would include the good things that we've been enabled to do. Well, that brings us then to chapter 30. That's how life was for Job. But that's not how life now is for Job. So he moves in chapter 30 from the past that was now to the present that is. And this is going to be, if you will, sort of an encapsulation of all of the things that we looked at beginning in chapter 4 that ran all the way through chapter 27, at least the things that he talks about. Although he's going to deal very specifically with the way that people have interacted with him. And that's going to be a little bit more so than he did previously. Well, the first thing he's going to do is talk about the way that he's having to deal with shame, the disgrace that he's having to address by the way people are interacting with him now that he is suffering. And he does this in two parts. He's going to talk about the persons themselves and then the kind of treatment that he's receiving. So first he talks about the mockers in verses 1 through 8. Well, all those things that he discussed in chapter 29, the respect that he received from others, the fact that when he would show up, everybody would quiet down and listen for him and wait for him to take the first step and essentially decide where things were going to go and how. All of that has changed. Now, his peers show no respect for him at all, and not only do his peers not show any respect, even the youth that you would expect to be very quiet around these elders. I mean, this is early Americana. This is not 21st century American at this point. But the youth, you would expect them to be very demure around an elder like Job. But they are absolutely not. They are doing everything but being respectful. They are the TikTokers today who are slapping teachers and doing all the various kinds of things in schools. And the sad thing is that these youth, and he describes them in rather great detail in some ways that is a little horrifying to us reading it, and we tend to get a little on our high horses perhaps as we read these verses and think Job is a little unfair in his description of them. But, in context, you got to keep in mind, chapter 29, that he really is a good person who will go out of his way to care for others. But now in response, even though he has treated them wonderfully, they're treating him anything but wonderfully. And so he describes them here not so much as youth, but as juvenile hoodlums. These are gang members who are going out of their way to inflict damage upon Job, not just upon his character, but upon even his very body, the way that they are treating him. Nobody really appreciates a bunch of little gangster hoodlums that contribute nothing at all to society. You just don't want to be around them very much. But Job was willing to do so at an earlier time in his life. But boy, he's sure taking it on the cheek from them at this point. And the sad thing is that they're actually parading for all to see the way that they are treated. It's not like they're doing it in secret when nobody's looking. These are persons who are parading their mistreatment of Job. It's a badge of honor to them. Well, so what are they doing? Well, one of the things that he mentions very specifically here is that they'll walk up to him and just spit in his face. You can imagine how you might want to respond to somebody if they did something like that to you. They mock him in song in verses 9 and 10. They do with him as they please in verse 11. They're like a siege army in the next couple of verses. They just keep coming at him and don't give him any rest whatsoever. They seem committed to actually trying to destroy him. And he says in verse 15, the last of these verses, that if somebody doesn't stop them, they are in fact going to destroy him. They're going to kill him. They're going to finish him off by the way that they're treating him if nobody puts a stop to it. Well, I mean, we know how this works in our own world. One of the ways that the miserable can feel better is to find somebody who's in worse shape. We all do that. One of the ways to feel better is to find somebody who's worse off than we are. And then we can not only point them out to ourselves, but then we can take advantage of them and others if we are that kind of person. So he has received all kinds of endless physical and verbal abuse and shaming over however long he's been out there on the ash heap. And at this point in time in his life, he's absolutely emotionally scarred. He's abused. And he knows he is, and he's not sure how he can get back from it at this point. So if we stopped and just, did a comparison of some sort, his past life was all light. Now it's all dark. It was all day, and now it's all night. It was once all full, and now it's all empty. It really could not be any worse as far as he's concerned. And on the basis of that, he then turns and makes an accusation against God. He's done this before, but now he retrieves those thoughts and makes them even in some ways more specific. His pain, he says, has become absolutely unbearable. And here's it's not just the physical pain, it's the emotional abuse that he has suffered. All of this has become such that he's just not sure he can last much longer. He feels like a cracked pot from which water just keeps escaping, leaking out. Or he's like a punctured tire from which air keeps hissing out. Can't get filled back up again. And in verses 18 and 19, he even uses a rather intriguing image. It's like God just picks him up, grabs him by his clothes so tightly that he can't even breathe. It's choking the very life out of him. And he can't get God to stop. On this side of George Floyd, we can kind of think about how this might be. And when God does finally let go of him, it's only to toss him like this over onto the trash heap, the ash heap that he's on. And when he finally lands and the plume of dirt finally settles down, he just is in worse shape than he was even to begin with. So despite all of his repeated cries that he has made to God, God continues to maintain to him this deaf ear, or what the Message Bible says is a blank stare. I just can't think of anything more horrible than to be trying to talk to God and get nothing but a blank stare in return. It gives real insight into how Job is feeling at this point. It's as if God's just been kicking him around for the sheer heck of it, just to be able to do so, just because he can do so, and has turned on him and doesn't show him any mercy at all at this point in time. And if he doesn't stop, and here he reiterates what he said on a number of occasions before, if God doesn't stop this treatment, it's going to be the death of him. He simply cannot hold out much longer. And the image that's used here is, it's as if life has itself become a storm, and he is dissolving like a salt block out there in this storm of life. Now, I hope your life hasn't ever been quite like that, but most of us have at least passed through moments in our life that have been like that. And many times when we face those moments, at least on the front end, hopefully at some point we can begin to get our bearings if it begins to lessen a bit, but certainly in the midst of it, we don't know how to respond. We're not even sure what the words are to be able to speak, or how to speak, or what to say to God. Well, and so there's this wonderful thing called Scripture that can offer us the words that we need when we don't have them ourselves. And Paul says that the Spirit will pray for us when we don't have the words. Well, there happens to be a psalm. If you've got a Bible with you tonight, you might want to turn to Psalm 44. If you don't, you'll just have to listen. But Psalm 44 speaks on behalf of the of the Jewish people, and for us today, the Christians as well, at a corporate level, the very same thing that Job is experiencing as an individual. So the first 8 verses describes the good things that God has done on behalf of God's people. But then verses 9 through 26 are essentially Job 30. What's life like when God is not responding anymore, but in fact seems to be having turned on you? Well, here's how Psalm 44 reads in the Nrsv. Keep in mind what you've just read in Job 30, and you'll hear Job speaking. It's going to be in the plural, but if you put it into the individual, you'll hear Job speaking. You, God, have rejected us and abased us. You've not gone out with our armies. You made us turn back from the foe, and our enemies have gotten spoiled. You've made us like sheep for slaughter and have scattered us among the nations. You've sold your people for a trifle, demanding no high price for them. You've made us the taunt of our neighbors, the derision and scorn of those around us. You've made us a byword among the nations, a laughingstock among the peoples. All day long my disgrace is before me, and shame has covered my face at the words of the taunters and the revilers, at the sight of the enemy and the avenger. All this has come upon us, yet we have not forgotten you or been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the haunt of jackals. You've covered us with deep darkness. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a strange God, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. Because of you, we are being killed all day long and accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake. Don't cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? For we sink down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up, come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. And isn't that Job? That's an amazing close connection to the book of Job, and a close connection to us. As I said, I hope that if you have gone through something like that in the past, that it's not where you're at right this moment, but if you are, well, just realize that there are words that are available to you to pray, to help you begin to have the words once again to speak to God. Well, on the basis of describing how he feels, what he thinks God is doing as well as not doing on his behalf, he then concludes this portion of his address by, again, issuing a kind of lament. And this is not a complaint. This is indeed a lament. It has the notion of really being addressed to God, thinking that God in the end is truly going to respond to him in appropriate ways. Instead of helping him out, instead of giving him a hand up, God continues to hand out affliction. Why? Why are you doing this, God? You know, that's not the way Job, acted. When Job heard the cries of the afflicted around him, when he heard the cries of the poor or the lame or the children or the widows, he responded with kindness, with aid that they needed. But now when he himself is in need, God is not doing the same for him. God is not offering any aid whatsoever. He's only offering, in fact, more evil. And Job simply does not understand. God's refusal to even lift a finger on his behalf has left Job's body just writhing in agony out there on the ash heap. And if anything, it's the emotional distress that he's feeling at this point that is just making it worse and worse. And so down in verse 29, he talks about his moaning being so constant at this point. Again, we don't know how long he's been there. Some texts suggest that it could have been years. Others just months, but gosh, if it's even just a few days, that's more than we would want to be there. But he says that his moaning has become so constant that now he sounds like a wild animal. And I can just imagine, not very well, but I can imagine what that suffering must be like. But speaking about moaning and sounding like a wild animal, this is a freebie. I think I've got enough time I can share this story with you. It's been 25 years ago now, but I came with a bunch of teens from the Nashville area and some of the youth leaders and some parents. And we did an overnight stay at the Heifer Ranch. It was still in Russellville. If you've never done that, you really should. And you don't have to take a bunch of teens. Assuming they still do the program, you can go as adults, and that's a perfectly good and appropriate thing to do. You can spend a night, or you can spend a week, a month. Doesn't matter how long you stay there, they'll find work for you to do, appropriate work, which will help them, but will also teach you about the inequities in life, in the world generally. But even if you're there just for a night, which is what we were, they get the message through pretty clearly. So we stayed a night, and what happens if you just spend the night is that they will divide you up into different encampments. You three will be in an Appalachian hut, and you guys will be in a Guatemalan house, and you'll be in an African teepee, I don't know what it was called, some African thing, and then you're in a Chicago barrio, and for supper tonight, here's the food, and you got to fix it yourself. But you don't all get this. You guys in the Chicago barrio, you get this and this and this, appropriate to a Chicago barrio. You guys in the Appalachian hut, you get the matches and the firewood and an onion or carrots or something. They had mercy on me. They let me be in the Guatemalan house, which was truly a house. I had a bed to sleep in that night and a stove to be able to cook on. But the thing is, they only gave me onions, 2 or 3 onions. Well, I'll guarantee you that a bunch of teens, when they had the opportunity to put one up over on the preacher, they weren't about to share their food with the preacher. They didn't want onions anyway, so I had nothing of value to be able to try to share with them. They weren't sharing anything with me, so all I could do that night was fix some onion broth on the stove. Well, I can eat a little bit of onion, but 3 big onions just weren't going to cut it, and I was already hungry. But life was the way it was that particular night, so I fixed my onion broth and I drank down every bit of that onion broth, hoping I could at least make it to breakfast in the morning. Well, in Russellville, out in the middle of nowhere, it was black as sin that night. You couldn't see right in front of your face. And somewhere in the middle of the night, I don't know if it was 2 hours after I laid down or 6, but I woke up and my stomach it wasn't just turning over, it was doing flip-flops and everything else in the world, and I thought, oh my goodness. So, there wasn't anything to do other than try to get back to headquarters, because I remembered there was a bathroom back there. So I trudged back along the top of that ridge to get back to the headquarters, only to find that the door was, of course, locked. The bathroom was locked up, so there wasn't anything at that point to do other than find my way back down the ridge road over to the Guatemalan house and tough it out to the next morning. Well, I got about 2/3 of the way back, and I'm up on the top of the ridge, and my stomach says, "You're not going any further," and it dropped me to my knees, and I was in dry heaves, just making the kind of noise you do in dry heaves, and I'm up on the top of this ridge, and so I'm reverberating everywhere over through various encampments. Well, after about 90 seconds of moaning like wild animals, I got back to my bed and I slept through the next morning, and I was fine when I went to breakfast. The teens got up at their breakfast. These are city kids. These are not farm kids. So they're all snickering with each other, and I they're sitting at the table behind me, and I'm hearing them talk about, did you hear that cow last night in the heat? All the noise it was making, and they started mimicking the moaning of the wild animal up on the top of the ridge. I never did tell them that that was me that was up on the ridge the previous night. It has nothing to do with Job, but other than the moaning of the wild animal. His body's aching with fever, he's rotting away. The only sounds that are coming from his mouth at this point are the aches and pains that he simply can't keep quiet anymore. Well, that gets you ready for question 2 in your workbook, which is based on chapter 30. What are the current struggles and fears that I face? Well, lack of respect, you name it, that I lament, or which are now threatening my own spiritual vitality. Well, it is, of course, good not to just look at blessings, but to realize, what are the struggle points I'm facing. Give me a couple more minutes on this one. And then there's chapter 31, where Job, by the time you get to the very end of the chapter, the first, almost the entirety of the chapter is really leading up to an oath that he will speak really in the final verses. And the oath is really the point of this chapter, but all that goes before it leads up to providing a rationale for why he can, in fact, make this oath. The oath is going to be essentially, God, you need to listen to me. You need to face me and explain why what is happening has in fact happened. You need to come clean regarding the way I'm being treated. And the reason he can essentially make that oath is because of the things he speaks beginning in verse 1, leading all the way up to that oath. And what he says is, time after time after time, I had opportunities, just like everybody else does, to engage in a variety of sins in life. In fact, he will end up listing 14 of them. A veritable double 7 case. It's not that he had a perfect opportunity, he had a double perfect opportunity of chances to be able to engage in sin, but he consistently said no to those opportunities over and over and over again. And that, certainly that's going to make him very different from the way that we've fallen prey to sin way too many times. But he's going to claim that he did not. And he starts off, we won't go into details on any of these, we don't really need to. This list, though, will help you be able to make sense of the individual pieces of how it all fits together. He addresses first the sin of lust in the first 4 verses. Well, we don't really need much of a primer on that one, but he says that doing right requires that you must decide to do right. If you don't decide to do right, you most likely will never actually do right. So even though he had opportunities, for instance, to look at persons in lustful ways, he chose on the front end not to do that. And that's what was able to keep him from actually engaging in lustful activities. And he goes so far as to say in these verses that, God certainly rewards the righteous, God punishes the wicked. God is absolutely aware of all that we do, and so even had he been truly tempted to do something, knowing that God was watching him, he wasn't about to engage in lustful activities. And then he turns to really 2 different things, but they're kind of mixed together in these next 4 verses, both falsehood, lying, and then the sin of covetousness. And there's a sense in which, if you've done much looking at or study of the deadly sins, the 7 deadly sins, you can see them kind of surfacing in the midst of what he's saying here. Job hasn't engaged in any kind of deceit in his life, he claims in verses 5 and 6. He's not even allowed any covetous thoughts to be able to lodge in his brain and actually begin to dwell on them. And that's, of course, a wonderful way to put it. That's how covetousness works, isn't it? We allow it to kind of lodge there, and as we kind of let it eat at us, then we start beginning to actually wish we had what that other person has. And he goes so far in verse 8, and he'll do this multiple times throughout this chapter, he'll go so far as to say, look, if I'm lying about any of this, then let such and such happen. Well, that's a pretty good way of declaring there's no way that I'm not telling the truth about this. I'm absolutely being a person of integrity and honor as I say these words. From falsehood and covetousness, he moves on to adultery. It's not just lust at this point, it's the actual sexual act. He's not engaged in adulterous thoughts or acts, either one. And at this point, if he's not being truthful about that, well then, let somebody steal his wife and treat his wife in adulterous ways. He's deserving of that if he's lying about the fact that he hasn't engaged in adultery. And down in verses 11 and 12, in a very insightful couple of verses, it's very clear to him, what is certainly true and clear to us as well, is that adultery is one of those sins that tends to destroy all that one has worked hard to achieve. His families fall apart because of that, and churches fall apart as a result of that, and sometimes even companies fall apart as a result of that. Adultery is not one of those things that's just between even 2 consenting adults. It ends up being something that has repercussions that spread out all over the place, and he's aware of that in verses 11 and 12. In verses 13 through 15, he talks about the opportunities that he had to mistreat servants who worked for him. Now, for us today, and I think this was even true in his era, we tend to, just because of the chattel slavery in America, which was absolutely inappropriate, we just tend to think in those kinds of terms about slavery. But really, my own personal understanding of what goes on in Scripture, when you read these comments about servanthood, you really need to be thinking about employees. Small business owners or big business owners and employee relationships. So when he's talking about mistreatment of servants, he's talking about mistreatment of employees, those persons who worked for him. And that certainly makes it a situation where we can make sense of it pretty easily in our own world today. He was always kind, he says, to his servants, to those who worked for him. He couldn't expect fair treatment from God if he hadn't treated his servants kindly. He's only expecting from God the same things that he shared with his employees. But because he treated his employees properly, he thinks that God should treat him fairly as well. In fact, he goes so far in verse 15 to say that, except for the simple fact that he was the employer and they were the employee, he didn't treat them any differently than he treated other employers. He treated everyone the same. We all had employers that acted in that particular way. In verses 16 through 23, I've kind of lumped all this together because I only had so much space. I could have put them all individually. He talks about the poor, the way he treated them, the naked the same way, and then also the weak. He offered aid to all of these different persons. He provided clothes when they needed them. As a judge, he didn't rule arbitrarily in ways that just were good for him. He tried always to judge in ways that would build up the persons that he was having to make a judgment for. And again, he comes down to the end of this and says, if I'm lying about any of this, let this happen to me. Let me be as one who is naked or hurting or needing a judgment on my behalf. But he says, as a wise person, he always tried to act righteously and justly on behalf of others. That ought to mean something, he thinks. Verses 24 through 28, it's really a couple of items in these verses. He didn't trust in wealth, even though he was incredibly wealthy. If not the wealthiest, certainly one of the wealthiest persons of his day. He did not trust in wealth. He just simply received it as the blessing that it was and then shared it munificently with those around him. And then also, he did not engage in the worship of heavenly bodies. He maintained his worship only toward God. That's one of those things that if we had lots and lots of time, we can start parsing out how it's possible to let our loyalties shift toward other things and other people and even other deities. But he's very clear that in his own personal life, he never engaged in any of those practices. And just to give one quick aside here, in the first century, in the Roman world, in the Roman Empire, one of the things that you needed to do when you went to any kind of a public display, like if you went to the Forum or if you went to this would have been first century, but if you went to the Colosseum, that's second century thing. But if you went there, as you walked in, one of the things that you needed to do was throw a little incense on the fire that was there. That was your way of essentially showing that you were faithful to the Roman Empire and to the emperor. At many levels, didn't mean anything. You just did it. But the Christians refused to do that because for them it was very clear that there's only one person to whom you are faithful. There's only one person to whom you give your full support, and that's God. You cannot share that with anybody, even the emperor. And so you cannot pretend to give the emperor your loyalty by throwing a little incense on the fire. So one of the ways that you can tell a Christian is that they refuse to do it. Well, throwing a little incense on the fire wasn't any different than you and I walking into a baseball game or any other kind of event, a basketball game at Arkansas, and they start playing the Star-Spangled Banner, and everybody stands and slaps their hand on their chest and sings it. Or the pledge to the flag. Well, how can you pledge your loyalty to a flag when you have pledged your loyalty to God? Or how can you sing that song that praises the country when you sing hymns to God? It's like throwing a little incense. Everybody does it. It means nothing. Well, does it or doesn't it? Job says that he refused to offer worship to anybody or anything other than to God alone. Verses 29 through 32, he never took any satisfaction at the ills that other people had. It's so easy to be able to jump on the bandwagons that deride those persons who are facing tough times. You know, right this moment in time, the Kansas City Chiefs look like the wheels have fallen off their bandwagon. And all the sportscasters and everybody who's a talking head are all jumping off the bandwagon like rats off a sinking ship at this point, saying, I knew it was coming, and blah, 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 blah. Well, Job says, I never did that. I never took opportunities to rail about what other people were facing and the failures that they had to address and deal with. He was always hospitable to them. In verses 33 and 34, he says, nor did I ever conceal my sin. I never acted in secret. I was always acting above board. There was not a secret me who was different from my public me. When I was behind closed doors, I was the same person that I was in the public sphere. Jumping just a few verses down to the end of the chapter, he even goes so far as to say that I didn't even abuse the land. Good ecological person here. He says, I treated my land the same way I treated other people. I treated it with respect, which should, make us feel good about things. And again, he says the same thing here as he said on another number of other occasions. If this weren't true, then, God just needs to let my land become nothing but a big briar patch. But this is the way that I acted. I acted appropriately in terms of my land. And so, finally, I've got to jump back just a couple of verses to this. He speaks this oath that begins in verse 35 and continues through 37. He is innocent. He's absolutely innocent, and so he calls on God to hear his pleas. You've been silent long enough. You haven't shown any sense that you have heard what I have said, but you need to stand to your feet now, God, and you need to pay me some attention, and you need to at least offer me enough respect to explain to me why you have thought it was appropriate to treat me the way that I have been treated. If I've done something inappropriate or wrong, my friends never did tell me or show me what that was, but you need to. If for no other reason, because of friendship, you need to let me know what that was. And because then you have told me, I'll then be able to respond to that with integrity. Because I don't have two different faces. I don't do things one way and then do them another. If you tell me what I've done, well, then I'll be able to respond. We'll have a real dialogue, a real conversation here. And so with that, Job has said all he needs to say. And he's finished. He doesn't speak again until God finally does address him toward the very end of the book of Job. Well, there's one more question that you've got a couple of minutes to look at. It looks at chapter 31. Job declared on oath that he had not done anything deserving his present affliction. I might have needed to give you about 20 pages for this, but what in my life would need to change for me to be able to declare a similar oath? Very appropriate question if this were the first day of Lent, if this were Ash Wednesday. All right, I implied on the front end of this session this evening that Job's really in two parts. It's chapter 1 through chapter 27. Then there's this break with kind of an intermission in 28, and then we start over in 29. And so in the same way that we started with Job, the second half it starts with Job. And then we move to the friends essentially berating Job. Come back next week in chapters 32 through 37. There's another friend who hasn't been mentioned yet, who stands up to begin berating Job. So we're continuing in this parallel universe between part 1 and part 2. And if nothing else, the mentioning now and arrival on the scene of Elihu helps us realize that through all that occurred in those earlier chapters, it's not just Job and his 3 friends and maybe his wife who are sitting out there. Based on what we heard him talking about all the youth that are mistreating him, there's a whole town that's there. It's a very public nuisance out there on the ash heap, and they're all seeing it. But now we see that there was one more person who's going to stand up and enter the fray. All right, so we're done with 31. We'll come back next week. We've only got 3 weeks left, 32 through 37 next week. Appreciate you taking time to be with our study tonight.
Thank you.